Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. Today we get to welcome Dr. Robert Jeanfreau to our show. Back in March, we had covered the story about clinical investigators, unsung heroes during the COVID-19 pandemic. We had the honor of talking with Dr. Jeanfreau, who is active in the New Orleans community and was integral in training healthcare workers on how to undertake COVID-19 testing. He also runs a clinical investigational site there. So Dr. Jeanfreau, welcome.
Good morning.
So doctor, can you share with us a little bit about your background? What made you decide to get into medicine?
When I was in college, I intended to go to graduate school to further my studies in German, and suddenly realized that would limit my job opportunities. Then I had some discussions with my brother who was starting medical school, and so it sounded like an interesting avenue. So I switched over and got the requisite courses and applied to medical school, and that's what happened.
Now, according to the statistics I've seen, roughly about 3% of doctors in the United States actually go on to become principal investigators. What made you consider this path?
The short answer is my wife. She has actually been in clinical research a lot longer than I have.
Oh, wow.
And she encouraged me to consider it, but being in active practice, it was difficult for me to envision how I could add any more into my workday. But eventually I succumbed. I did get started in clinical research and now wish I had started much earlier.
So what about MedPharmics? How did you get that started?
So my wife and I were previously employed by an SMO, and we decided that we would like a greater say-so in how decisions were being made. So we started our own company. We sat down and tried to come up with names, and she came up with the name MedPharmics.
So doctor, tell me, what do clinicians or physicians bring to the table that may or may not otherwise be addressed?
One of the things that I think gets overlooked in clinical research is that clinicians, that is physicians who have been in clinical practice, bring to the tables issues that may not or frequently not addressed by others. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. The issue of addressing AEs, where the principal investigator has to assign causality and severity. Typically, the coordinators are the ones who collect the data on AEs and bring it to the principal investigator for him to decide those two issues, causality and severity. And when I first started, I would get things like, okay, the subject is having a headache, which in private practice, that's essentially worthless information in terms of trying to determine the severity and causality.
Right.
So it became apparent to me very early on that there was a great deal of variation in the thoroughness in which these AEs were being collected. To someone who is new to the area, it may seem pretty straightforward, but it's not. And so it became very obvious to me that the quality of the AE description varied very widely, even within a single site. You would get someone who had perhaps more medical background and could do a better job in providing me with the information that I needed in order to render judgments regarding causality and severity. So, in fact, I just did this last year in an attempt to provide some uniformity to how AEs are described and collected by coordinators. I picked the 50 most common AEs, and I sat down and said, how would I address this if I was in private practice still and someone, say, came in complaining of headaches? What are the questions that I would really want answered? And so I wrote all those questions down, and with an IT guy, we arranged them in a sensible, logical order, because not every question, some questions would only be addressed depending upon how a previous question was answered. So it's sort of a branching logic type of thing.
Right.
And so we did that and it ended up being several thousand questions. And the idea, and we haven't actually initiated this because the COVID pandemic has interrupted that project. But the idea is to load these questions into a tablet that either the CRC can use on if he's addressing the subjects in a telephone call, or if the subjects are in the waiting room, we can give them the tablet so that they can answer the questions. So then the PI gets, the program generates sort of a summary based on the questions. It's much like what I would expect, say, in the hospital, where you get a summary like, the subject is a 56-year-old male complaining of frontal headache that's lasted for 5 days. You get a kind of description that we are accustomed to seeing, and provides the information that we need in order to make a decision regarding causality and severity. Because as PIs, we are not just tasked with trying to make sure that subjects are protected from the investigational product, but if a subject presents with symptoms totally unrelated to the investigational product, let's say chest pain, we still have the burden of making sure that person is adequately taken care of. And so if someone presents with chest pain that is very suggestive of coronary ischemia, we don't just say, okay, well, it's not related to the drug. We have to make sure that person gets adequate attention. So it becomes important that we get, really for every symptom, an adequate description. And so that was the point of writing these questions and putting them in a logical sequence, and then putting them in a tablet where it offers uniformity across all this. We have a number of sites now, and so ideally this would provide a uniform way of collecting the data, which I would think the pharmaceutical industry in general would be very interested in that approach. And it would be, we have patient recorded data that we use, these little handheld devices, and that it could be loaded into something like that as well, so that the subjects could record this kind of thing at home. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I was astounded that no one had really, at least as far as I could see, no one apparently saw the deficiency in the way this information was being collected, and almost the haphazard way it was being collected, and not only the impact on the quality of the study, but on the impact on the quality of care for the subjects. So, and this is what clinicians bring to the table because of our background. That's our viewpoint. That's what we bring.
So, what kind of clinical research have you specialized in? What kind of clients do you work with?
We typically have done vaccine studies, which when I first started looking at vaccine studies, it seemed a sort of a dry area and uninteresting, which has turned out to be completely wrong. It's an incredibly interesting field, and I just love doing vaccine research.
Now, in the vaccine world, typically, now things have obviously been changed here with the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's a lot more nimbleness happening, but looking at the vaccine challenge, where you have your discovery phase, your preclinical trials, your phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, and the odds of getting through, what would be the biggest challenges that you've faced?
The biggest challenge that I face is staying current in the new knowledge that's being accumulated. When I was in medical school, what we knew about immunology could fit in a thimble, and that over the last 30 years has changed dramatically, and new information is accruing every day. And that, for me, is personally my biggest challenge, is trying to keep up and assimilate the new information as it becomes available.
So let's shift a little bit here to COVID-19. Can you share from your point of view, how could this pandemic, or how has this pandemic impacted clinical investigational sites?
Well, it's impacted investigational sites in a number of ways. The biggest one is that a lot of what used to be done in a face-to-face setting is now being done remotely, either by phone or computer, due to the social restrictions on seeing patients.
Yes, not to mention the fear that some patients might have of going into the hospital because of COVID-19.
and we do take definite steps to reduce the risk of patients who are subjects who do come to the site. It's not an irrational concern. So we do have significant restrictions in place to prevent any sort of transmission of disease here.
So, do you think that this is temporary? And if not, how do you think clinical research will change post COVID-19?
I think what people are realizing, and not just in the clinical research, but in general, is that the things that we used to think required our personal attendance, and a good example of that in clinical research is the investigator meetings. This will accelerate that. There will probably be much less in-person meetings, for example, the investigator meetings, and there will be a move toward telehealth. I think those are probably two examples that come to me most readily.
Absolutely. So, on COVID-19, do you have any opinion on any treatment prospects?
So the disease process, first of all, there's a lot about the disease process we don't understand, and it's a complicated phenomenon with different stages. So many of the treatments focus on very particular aspects of the disease process. Much of the initial research was focused on the cytokine storm and the complex immunology involved in that. But there's also individuals trying to focus on the earlier phases of the disease process where people are mildly symptomatic. And that's a totally different set of therapies. So the research is dependent on what particular aspect of the disease process you're trying to address. There's a lot of talk about hydroxychloroquine, particularly in an earlier phase of the disease. Whether or not that's helpful, I don't think has been fully determined yet. There was the recent large VA study that suggested it wasn't particularly useful. I think that study had a lot of potential drawbacks in reaching that determination.
Right.
I think some ongoing double-blind studies will help to clarify the question as to how useful that drug is going to be.
Yes. And then there's also Ivermectin that's been getting some attention recently as well.
Yes, that's true. Many of those things, when the pandemic hit, there's a lot of talk about the standard of care. And essentially, the standard of care was just supportive care. I mean, we didn't have any drugs that were approved, so it was very hard to know. As a clinician, it was chaotic trying to figure out how to treat these patients. It was essentially a new disease, and physicians were really behind the eight ball and trying to figure out what to do for these people who were desperately ill.
So let's shift back then to your practice. Can you tell us about MedPharmics' collaboration with East Jefferson General Hospital in collecting blood samples to support clinical trials addressing this COVID-19 and the extreme cases that it's been producing?
Well, I can tell you exactly how that started. We had approached East Jefferson General Hospital about getting involved in inpatient trials and started some initial discussions on how that would work. And the chief medical officer called me one day and said, "Hey, did you see the physician in Shreveport who got convalescent plasma as part of this Mayo Clinic program?" And I had not seen that. So I looked into it and got on board pretty early. And so that was my initial collaboration with the hospital. We, as a clinical research site, were able to locate people who had recovered from the infection and were willing to provide their plasma as treatment for individuals who were desperately ill in the hospital. In fact, much of our initial plasma came from physicians and nurses in the same hospital. And our very first patient who got treated was a physician who had been taking care of hospitalized patients and became desperately ill. He was on a vent. His wife had signed a DNR order and we got a call about trying to give him this convalescent plasma. Of course, the study it's not blinded, there's no control arm, so it's difficult to interpret the data, particularly early on in the course of a study like this. But at
Right.
any rate, one of the other physicians donated his blood, and from which we derived the plasma, and he got transfused. And within 48 hours, he was off the vent.
Oh, wow.
And it appeared to be a remarkable turnaround. And he was the 300th individual to get plasma nationwide. And currently we're at about 13,000 people. So from such a large quantity of individuals, I think we should be able to draw some useful conclusions from this study about the usefulness of convalescent plasma and the antibodies contained therein.
Well, it's amazing work that you guys are doing over there, and we've been watching with great interest. So, Doctor, let's shift then to the future. How do you anticipate your need to morph in the future with how trials may change? For example, as we talked about earlier, with virtual technology, telehealth, smart apps, and other breakthroughs.
Well, I think the technology offers a great deal in terms of a great deal of clinical research. And I think the telemedicine that we've already mentioned, I think is going to be a part of it. And I will need to get further training in telemedicine. I can mention technological advancements can significantly improve research. This is another idea I've been working on. One of the problems we have in SAEs is not just our site, but just in general, is the timely reporting of SAEs, which are reported within 24 hours. And so when a subject, let's say a guy is in a diabetic study and he shows up in the emergency room with chest pain, calling the research site is one of the last things on his mind. It's difficult to keep track of when people experience SAEs. So an idea that I've been proposing is that we use, assuming that it meets all the criteria, all the regulatory criteria, is to use a personal tracker that can be either loaded onto a phone, or there are small devices that can be added to a keychain, and you can load information about, let's say you could put in the location of all hospitals within a 20-mile radius of this person's address. You could even put in the person's physician's office address and urgent cares, so that and you can say how much time a person would have to be at one of these sites to receive an alarm. So the research site could be alerted when it wouldn't require the individual's active initiation. The device itself would send an alarm to the research site saying, your guy has just spent 40 minutes. He's typically, I would say 40 minutes is a good time frame. Otherwise, if a person's driving by a hospital, it would set off an alarm, but you can set a time. So person's been in the hospital for 40 minutes. This is probably an SAE. Most SAEs accompany a trip to the hospital. Now, it's not going to solve the issues completely, but I think it would significantly advance our way of keeping track of SAEs. You get an alarm like that, you can call a family, find out what's going on, and it would be a much more timely way of keeping track. And that, I think, is a good example of how technology can improve our clinical research experience.
Agreed. So, any final thoughts for our audience at Trial Site News?
I think the biggest thing is for people to realize that clinical research is an integral and critical part of the healthcare process, that without research, we end up, not having drugs that are proven to be safe and efficacious. And research has sort of taken a background seat in healthcare, and until now, when it becomes very obvious how critical a role we play in the health of the country. And I think people are beginning to understand what we do, and there's much less fear associated with clinical research. In the past, we would approach someone about being in a study, and sometimes we would get an answer that they don't want to be a guinea pig. The implication being that this person doesn't have any say so, doesn't understand the research they're being involved in. I always explain that we never have guinea pigs in research, in clinical research, that everyone who gets in research understands what they're getting involved in and what their contribution is, that they really are medical heroes making advances in therapeutics that will potentially could help millions of people. So if anything good comes from this pandemic, that would be one thing.
I agree, and I think you hit a really good point on the head there, which is the public at large and their understanding of clinical trials, why it's so important. It's something that I think desperately needs more focus on publicly.
Yes.
Well, Doctor, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. We know you have a busy schedule, and we're very interested in your work at MedPharmics, and we will absolutely be keeping track of how things progress for you and yours over there in New Orleans.
Thank you, sir.